Okay, so um, what are we going to talk about today? So we're a week behind, but we will move forward in terms of our topic. So this week's topic is looking at the organization and the structure of higher education to just make sure that we're on the same page. These learning objectives were posted in the PDF file that I gave you, and also there is a narration, the audio that went with it. So the first learning objective is defining the difference between public and private institutions. The other second objective is to identify diverse types of higher education institutions that we talked about earlier in today's lecture. And then lastly, understand the internal organization structure of higher education. We say that the organization higher education seems very similar, but I have to say, being in so many different institutions from community colleges in New York, Texas, and also at other states, to different universities in different states and also countries, the structure is very different. So you have to understand the internal organization structure to understand how decisions are made in the organization. So what does this mean? The overview of higher education. So in your groups, you are able to pair up and look at the org chart or organization chart. And a lot of times there's some common components or common organizations or structures in higher education. So there's always a governing body. What does that mean? The governing body means that there are people who are making regulations and policies regarding the university. Okay. Administration. So there are different types of administrators who are running the organization. So organizations, also every day-to-day operations, etc. So the management aspect of it. What's different about higher education organization is there's an academic side. There are in industries where they have learning or professional branch, or it could be a department. The academic side is all over the higher education organization structure. So that's the unique aspect of it, just because that's what they're there for. They need teachers or professors to teach. As well as faculty. So meaning the faculty members are going to be divided into various different categories. You probably have heard tenure track, non-tenure track, clinical track, assistant, associate, professor. There's all these different ranks. What do they all mean, right? So people from the outside, even my husband, I've been in academia for a quarter century. He sometimes doesn't understand the lay of the land because you really have to experience it as a student and also as a faculty or administrator or in the governing body. Okay, so what does a governing body mean in higher education? It's usually board of trustees, and we'll talk more about each of the categories later. But just to be on the same page in terms of the vocabulary, the administration is usually a president or chancellor, assisted by like VP or vice chancellors, and you saw it in the organization chart of UTSA. I think it was another Texas university that I saw. Harvard was another one, and several others. And the academic side that I was telling you about was the organization size, meaning how are the higher organization composed up of. So for instance, UIW used to be a college, remember? And then it got built into a university with 11 different schools. So right now there's colleges and schools, and then there's also departments within each colleges and schools. So you have the university. Within colleges or school, we'll talk a little bit more about that. There's departments depending on which discipline they're in. And then the faculty aspect, like who's running, right? Who's teaching the students? they're organized into ranks, like I said, assistant, associate, and professor, for instance. And there's non tenure track, tenure track, clinical track, etc. There's different adjuncts is another one. So there are different levels, and even in adjunct, there's also assistant, associate, full professor, adjuncts as well, depending on what university you're at. And some university just call it, adjunct instructors or professors. So it all depends. So what does it mean? So what factors that can influence higher organization? Anyone know? Can you put it in the chat? What factors that can influence higher organization structure? What do you think? Yes, a funding. Yes. Yeah, definitely. And then funding, usually large universities, right, get funding, and also schools that have a lot of branding, for instance. I think everyone can probably recognize, for instance, Harvard or some other different universities that we can think of just by looking at the logo. So indeed, the size of the institution, like for instance, UTSA, I know when I was there, it was a smaller university. Now there's a whole big campus. You guys said 34,000, right? And these, when you see the Roadrunner, right? If you're in San Antonio, you know. And then for us, UIW Cardinals, right? So size of the institution matters. So when you have a big size, of student body, look at how much free advertisement, right? A lot of the parents ask their friends, oh, where's your kid going to school, right? So they're like, oh, UTSA, right? That's all kind of free advertisement, right? So bigger the size, more word of mouth, right? And also depending on how it's operated, usually big size universities, they have really well-oiled machinery of administrators who are managing their funds and also their staff and faculty pretty well. So type of institution, so meaning where what kind of university is it? Community? Is it a research institution, teaching institution, etc.? So there's different types of institution where some people want to go to public, some people want to go to private, some people want to go to faith-based university, or women's college, for instance. So there are different types of institutions that are out there. Location does really matter, meaning that some people want to go to a school in metropolitan area. Like for me, I wanted to go to an urban setting where I can experience everything that I was doing, meaning if I wanted to work in a lab, I can go work in a lab. If I wanted to work in a community where there's a need, I was able to do that. Or if I wanted to go work in Wall Street, for example, it was right down the subway. So location wise, you want to be very, it's really important to understand like what region you want. Like San Antonio, for example, it's a metropolitan, but it's spread out, right? There's not a public transportation that is reliable. You need to drive a car, for instance, or you may want to go to a school with dormitories, for example. So location is going to be very, very important because it also dictates the type of culture, for example. So schools in the north versus schools in the south, east versus west in the United States have really different type of culture, for example. So for instance, in California, if you're at a school that's right by the beach, for instance, there may be a lot of marine biologists and also people who enjoy surfing, right? So the culture and location, all those things matter. Another thing that we did touch upon is the historical factors. So meaning, is it historically Black or historically Hispanic? Those are the two categories that we're going to see in different types of university. By no means this is a comprehensive list, of factors that can influence higher education. There's also policies, etc. But just internally, just looking at the structures, there are these factors that are going to impact the organization and structure and management, especially budget and finance, is going to be greatly affected by it. So those of you who are not familiar with the history, the historical factors of an institution is going to matter. So UIW, for instance, it's founded in, I believe, 1881, right? So we have a long history, and a lot of different universities do. Some of them may have short histories as well. Institutions that have been around for a long time have developed more complex organization structures, and also they have a lot of connections in the community as well. So institution that started out really small, like our institution, it was a college, right? And built into this university, may have organizations that look like colleges but also look like university, and it has like that hybrid format. So it's going to be very important to kind of look at the history and the growth. On the other hand, the newer university, those with a shorter history, may have a simpler structure. So if you look at Google, for instance, I know it's not a higher education. They have a very interesting organization structure where it's like a spoke where people talk to their direct managers and other folks and exchanging ideas. Whereas some of the higher institutions, we actually follow some of the traditional layers of organization, like the president and chancellor on top, and then some of the administrators going down, reporting to them. So you really have to look at the history as well as how that impacts the organization as well. We briefly touched on this. So historically, Black colleges, it means that it was established with the goal of providing education to African American students or Black students. These colleges typically emphasize the importance of the African American culture, histories, and values. And remember, these universities were established before 1964 with the primary mission of serving this population. On the other hand, the other historically Hispanic colleges, HSI, right, are institutions of higher education that have a student body with at least 25% Hispanic. And it was established to make sure that the accessibility of higher education for this group, so Hispanic students. So you want to also look at how it is labeled as well. So I believe UTSA is historically Hispanic college. UIW is also considered institution as well. And if I may be wrong, I think there are institutions, and UTSA might be one of the few that is in that high category, which is the research one institution, which is deemed as the research. So they're bringing a lot of funding from their research, which was not the case many years ago. It was a teaching institution. So type of institution, we talked about this briefly. So what should you be thinking about in terms of different types of institution is this: public versus private. Okay, so what does it mean? Public institutions are usually funded by the government source, so they're getting more from the government. And like UTSA, if you go to UTSA website, you could get all the faculty salaries because it is a state school. But on the other hand, UIW private, they have different types of funding coming in. So not all the information is actually included in public domain. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, different legislations. You guys are doing great. Yeah. So, what are the other types of institution? I think we talked about this before. Community colleges, right? Or associate level, 4-year universities. There's also different types of university, research versus teaching university. This was established way back in the Carnegie era to figure out what type of university it is in terms of trying to categorize undergrad versus graduate, also how many people are getting research funding versus teachers, etc. So there's different designation of research. So research, it's R1 is the research institution, and it goes from R1, R2, R3, and usually R3 is a teaching level. R1 is where like 60% of their revenue is coming from grants, is what I believe. So I have to double check on those numbers. But another category that you haven't seen, but you know that they exist, is online universities. So you probably have seen University of Phoenix, there's DeVry, there's a lot of online universities where they may have a physical presence on one site, but the university itself is online, it's virtual. So that's another type of university as well. Um, the list is pretty long, meaning you can go to a liberal arts versus a military college. So West Point, Air Force Academy, Naval Academy are examples of those. Faith-based, so Catholic University or Christian University, for example, are examples of those. We talked about the teaching versus research universities. Historical colleges that we talked about, Black versus the Hispanic, historical universities, online universities, and lastly, I touched on this before, women's college. There's 7 women colleges in the nation. Like Vassar used to be one, but they became co-ed. At Harvard, it's Radcliffe. At Columbia, it's Barnard. There's Wellesley, Smith. I'm trying to remember the other 7 sisters, but there is 7 of them that exist, but only a few actually is single sex women's college. And then specialized universities. There may be some universities where it's only for art or performance and art, for example. So there may be universities like that where only highly skilled students are admitted into those universities. So there are different types, and you can see when you're thinking about those programs, you have to be very thoughtful in terms of where you want to house these programs. Where are they going to be really successful? So we talked about the location. UIW has international, right? Sister branches, for example, they just opened up a Mexico campus, I believe last year. And you also have the US where they have satellite campuses in different places. And then going back internationally, I can talk about University of Maryland. Those of you who have some military service, they're global, meaning that they have campuses all over Europe and Asia, but their main campus is in College Park in Maryland, but they have international offices and schools and facilities where students take classes. You can only, like I said, you could have campuses that's only located in the US. And then there are state universities, meaning, for instance, Rutgers, right? University of Berkeley, for example, that's a California state. University of Chicago is another one. University of Florida. So there's a lot of different state universities that are either public or private. We talked about Baylor, we talked about Trinity is another one in San Antonio, St. Mary's. I could name quite a few. And then urban, suburban, and rural. So people may choose in terms of comfort level or opportunities. So, depending on where the physical university is located, for instance, like some people like the rural setting because it offers more specialized courses, not a lot of distractions. So, for instance, if you're undergrad, if you're living in a city, first time being away from home, being in an urban setting might not be the greatest choice because there's a lot of distractions, right? So, very good. And then let me talk to you about the size of the institution. How is it determined? How do we know it's a large size versus small size? It's student enrollment. Okay, that's what it is. So large versus small. And then in terms of the organization chart, all of you did such a beautiful job. I know that a lot of you have a business background or know of business. So a lot of times the board of directors sits on the top, advises the CEO, right? Chief Executive Officer, and then you have different administrators going down, and then you have different areas of expertise of administrators managing their team. So the organization chart that I'm sharing with you, this is UIW. So we have the president, Dr. Evans on top, and then we have all these VPs that you see on the left-hand side. The VP of Legal Affairs, VP of Academic Affairs, VP of Strategy and Enrollment, and then we have Chief of Financial Officer and VP of for the Administrative Services, right? And then we have VP of External Relations. So you could see the administrators, and then we have International Affairs, and then because we're faith-based, we also have VP for Missions and Ministry is another category. And if you go to UIW, that's the president's office, and then we have a different organization chart that also looks at the provost at top, because each one of these VPs also manages different staff and faculty depending on what their specialty is, and it follows that organization chart. And what I wanted to do is give you side by side comparison. The board of directors goes on top of the president, meaning the board of director for UIW advises the president. Okay, and then so we're doing great. So administration, we are either led by the president or chancellor. They're similar, but depending on which university, that's what you want to look at when you are looking at the program. Yes, you're looking at the program, but you're also looking at where's it located in the in terms of the university, right? Is it led by president or chancellor? You have vice president or vice chancellors that you saw for specific areas of operation. And then the provost is the chief academic officer. So that's also a person that you want to look at to see, because this is the person who is giving direction on what academic direction we're going to go into. The president or the chancellor looks to the provost to set the tone for the academic side of it. Okay, so faculty members like myself, right now there's a provost search right now because our provost retired, and we are looking to see who the next provost is going to be and what our next steps are going to be as a university. So once again, go back, UIW, it's easy to go to the site and see the organization. So colleges, each are responsible for a particular field of study. So I think we mentioned about College of Education, College of Science, and then within it, you have departments. So for example, within a School of Education, we have Teachers Ed and Graduate Studies. When you look at schools like Harvard, Columbia, there's a whole bunch of, and then UTSA, we talked about how there's massive amounts of faculty members in the one school. So it depends on subject areas. I'm looking at the time. And the faculty members, those of you who are interested in going into academia, it's organized in rank based on experience and accomplishment. So you start from assistant to associate and professor, meaning, and that also signifies that you're on the tenured line, and that's what you call in academia very coveted. But nowadays, it doesn't mean anything if the program doesn't survive. If there's no school with a program, the faculty line disappears regardless, right? So primary affiliation with the department, but also you may be associated with the school. So the appointment is usually like you're a professor of education or professor of chemistry, professor of business, for example. Okay, just 1 minute about the governing power institutions. So the governing body of a higher institution is responsible for setting overall direction and policy of the institution. So it's really important to see who they are. They establish mission, vision, and values of the institution with the direction of the president and also faculty senate as well. You also approve budget and major finances as well for the Board of Trustees, and appointing and evaluating the institutional president or chancellor. So if they're not doing a great job, the Board of Trustee has the ability to put the president or chancellor on notice, and also are able to actually fire them as well. You want to ensure institutional compliance with legal and regulatory requirements. So I'm going to just go to this one last slide and then show you who they are, because I think some of you are thinking, oh my God, Board of Trustees for a university must be, these people, right? But it's made up of faculty members, students, alumni, community members, and then ex officios, which are usually the president or the chancellor who sits on the body, has no voting power whatsoever. So I'm going to stop here because I want to make sure that you have enough time